Hi everyone, welcome to Nottingham Contemporary. My name's Isabel Whiteleg and I'm head of the public programme here. As many of you know, Nottingham Contemporary is not itself a museum and it does not have a collection, although it is at the moment home to one, a collection that itself does not have a museum. And this temporary situation created one pretext for this evening's discussion. Another was the recent publication of Claire Bishop's Radical Museology, or What's Contemporary in Museums of Contemporary Art, which discusses 3 case studies, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, the Van Aber in Eindhoven, and MSUM in Ljubljana. Reflecting the approach of this book, we were interested in inviting representatives of contemporary art museums that maintain a critical, reflexive attitude to the use, display, and acquisition of their public collections. Those represented in this evening's discussion reflect activity in this country as well as within other European sites where nationally owned collections may play a particularly significant role in enacting historical narratives and activating cultural memory. So to begin with, Claire will present an overview of the book Radical Museology, and this will be followed by a response by each of our panelists in turn. Jesús Carrillo from the Reina Sofia, Marta Dziewanska from the Museum of Modern Art, Warsaw, and Francesco Manacorda from Tate, Liverpool. In preparation, we've asked them to consider one or more of the following questions. What models of history and/or temporality have informed the collection hangs at your respective institutions? Can a national art museum be critical, or is it always tied to the celebration of national narratives? And what is the relationship between the historical narratives presented in the museum and the educational programs you've devised to support them? And then after a discussion between the 3 panel participants with Claire, we'll take the questions from the floor. We're also this evening live streaming this talk and recording it, so if you have a question at the end, for the benefit of the audience here and also the audience online, if you could wait until the roaming mic is in your hand, it would be much appreciated. So finally, I'm going to offer a brief introduction to our 4 guests this evening. Claire Bishop is Professor of Contemporary Art at the Graduate Centre of CUNY, the City University of New York. She taught previously at Warwick University and the Royal College of Art and completed her PhD at the University of Essex. Radical Museology is her most recently published book, and she is also the author of Artificial Hells, Participatory Art and the Politics of Spectatorship, Participation for the Whitechapel and MIT series Documents of Contemporary Art, and Installation Art, A Critical History. Claire is a regular contributor to both Art Forum and October, and her current research addresses the impact of digital technologies on contemporary art and questions of amateurism and de-skilling in contemporary dance and performance art. Jesús Carrillo is head of cultural programs at Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofia, Madrid, a role he combines with that of professor of the history and theory of art at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. His work with the Reina Sofia involves collaboration with activist and independent collectives and networks outside of the museum, as well as the development of temporary exhibitions and collection displays within it. And he's also worked as the editor of the series Desacuerdos sobre art, políticos y esfera pública en el Estado español, on art, politics, and the public sphere in the Spanish state. Marta Dziewanska is curator and publications director at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. She is co-author of Post-Soviet Art, Politics and Society in Russia at the turn of the decade, and co-editor with Claire Bishop of 1968 to 1989, Political Upheaval and Artistic Change. Exhibitions she has curated at MoMA Warsaw include Awkward Objects and Ion Grigorescu in the Body of the Victim. And speaking finally, Francesco Manacorda, who joined Tate Liverpool as artistic director in April 2012 and continues to be a visiting lecturer in exhibition history and critical theory at the Curating Contemporary Art Department of the Royal College of Art, London. He has previously served as director of Artissima in Turin and curator at Barbican Art Gallery where he realized large-scale exhibitions including Radical Nature, Art and Architecture for a Changing Planet, 1969 to 2009, and commissions by artists including Raphael Lozano Hema and Hans Schabas. He was a member of the international jury for the most recent Venice Biennale and is a regular contributor to publications including Domus, Flash Art, and Art Review. So I will now hand over to Claire to begin. Thank you.
Hi. I'm going to have some water. So thank you, Nottingham Contemporary, for this invitation. It's really nice to be here. I'm a big fan of the programme. And I'm really flattered that they're organising this event, sort of spinning off from this little book, which is the worst distributed book in history. You can't find it in the shop upstairs. I've yet to find a shop where you can buy it. It's published by Walter Koenig Books, so I guess maybe in London at their shop at a certain time you can get it. Anyway, so as you can see, it's slim. It's basically an article. But I did a little book because I was working in collaboration with Dan Pajowski, who's done the drawings that you're going to see, accompanying this highly reduced, concise version of the argument. So the book takes its lead from a number of things. Firstly, this glut of discussions around the contemporary that took place around 2010, where a number of journals like October and Eflux magazine were all having a sort of a moment of consternation around what is the contemporary, what is contemporary art, how do we define this thing which is undergoing such a boom through museums and biennials. Related to that, I organised a conference around contemporary museums of art in New York in 2011 with the New Museum and Independent Curators International. And that was a funny event because it really produced a division between the curators on the one hand and art historians on the other. And it led to the worst kind of stereotyping of both. So for the curators, the art historians were just completely locked into chronological narratives and, like dusty researchers with no sense of current urgencies. And for the art historians, the curators were just sort of vapid jet setters chasing the zeitgeist. And so at the end of this 4-day conference, there was like an impasse where they couldn't really talk to each other, which was interesting, but it also threw down a gauntlet for me as an art historian to try and write something that would address curating. And Terry Smith, who you probably know is a well-known Australian art historian based in University of Pittsburgh, I think. He's also produced a book that came out of this conference. So his little green book, I think it's called Thinking Contemporary Curating, was also a sort of a spin-off of this conference. Then on top of that, just to give you a little bit more background, I moved from the UK to New York in 2008, and I really disenchanted with the state of museums there. So corporate, so in the hands of trustees, so privatized, and so lacking any of the energy that I found in a handful of remaining European institutions that still had public funding. And then, of course, the financial crash had produced a threat to that system of public funding in Europe. And we know the consequences of this, with museum budgets being slashed and institutions being encouraged to turn to more philanthropic models of private investment to subsidize their activities. So that's just the general background. So there's a lot of things going on there. So what I'm going to do then is just begin this little summary, which is going to deal really with the theoretical structure, underpinnings of the book, which takes its lead from 3 museums that I see doing an incredibly important progressive job in Europe. These are, as Isabel mentioned in the introduction, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana, which opened just a couple of years ago. And I'm not going to discuss those because we have case studies in the second half of this evening, including the Reina Sofia is one of them. So this is just going to be a little bit more theoretical, but I've got Dan Pajowski's images running alongside it. So I'm going to start by setting 2 models of contemporaneity against each other. So this is, summarizing from all of these debates around the contemporary that have taken place over the last 5 years. So the first model is the presentist model, the condition of taking our current moment as the horizon and destination of our thinking. This is the dominant usage of the term contemporary in art museums today. It's underpinned by an inability to grasp our moment in its global entirety and an acceptance of this incomprehension as a constitutive condition of the present historical era. The second model, which I want to sketch here, takes its lead from the practice of the three museums I've just mentioned. Here, the contemporary is understood as a dialectical method and a politicized project with a more radical understanding of temporality. It's what I want to call dialectical contemporaneity, and it doesn't designate a style or a periodization of works of art so much as an approach to them. It's a way of telling history. So the presentist model is the one we attach to the contemporary art museum boom that's taken place so aggressively since the 90s. Whether we look at recent museums in America, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, or Asia, what they all have in common is an economy of privatization. Private collectors donating standalone wings attached to museums. If you think of the Flick collection in Berlin, the Thompson collection at the Art Gallery of Ontario. We also have corporations building museums. This is especially in Asia and Latin America, the Samsung Museum of Art in Korea, Jumex in Mexico City. We have private collectors building their own museums, such as the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, Inyotim in Brazil, the Garage Center, now Museum for Contemporary Art in Moscow, Malba in Buenos Aires, and many museums in China that are basically Kunsthalles without a collection. Just to name a few, the Beijing Today Art Museum, Shanghai's Minsheng Art Museum, the Rockbund Museum of Art, the Guangdong Times Museum, and so on. And of course, then we have the controversial franchising of museums. The Guggenheim spread globally, the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, and so on. So only a small minority of new museums are state-funded, and they're vastly outnumbered by the privatized model that defines contemporaneity less in terms of a concern for a collection, a history, a position, or a mission, than in the staging of contemporaneity on the level of image. The new, the cool, the photogenic, the well-designed, the economically successful. And let's see, why is that not moving forward? Yeah. In the book, I talk a little bit about the new museum as really marking this transition from a concern with acquiring new works and moving them, but also moving them on. So when the new museum began in the mid-70s, it began with what is called a semi-permanent collection. So works would be acquired, and then within 5 years they would be sold on in order to raise money to keep buying new works by younger artists. Of course, while this was in tune and to a certain respect with sort of conceptual and process-based art of the 70s, it provides a perfect segue into the market economics of the 80s, where works are bought and sold with a rapid turnover. Let's say the Saatchi model of acquiring and disposing of collections. So in tandem with this proliferation of contemporary art museums, contemporary art has become the fastest growing subject area in the university since the turn of the millennium. Here, the definition of the contemporary has become a moving target. So when I was doing my PhD in the 1990s, it seemed synonymous with art after 1945. Around the turn of the millennium, it seems to start somewhere in the 60s. Today, the 60s and 70s generally tend to be viewed as high modernist, and the argument has been put forward that we should consider 1989 as the beginning of a new era, synonymous with the fall of communism and the emergence of global markets and the internet. While each of these periodizations has its pros and cons, the overwhelming drawback is that they operate from a Western purview. In China, India, and Africa, contemporary art tends to be dated, respectively, from the late 70s, from the 1990s, from the end of colonialism, which could be the 1950s in the case of Anglophone countries in Africa, or the 1970s in the case of Portuguese-speaking countries. And in the case of Latin America, there's still arguably no real division of modern contemporary, because this would mean conforming to hegemonic Western categories. So it almost goes without saying then that the attempt to understand the contemporary as a periodization, of saying that it begins at this particular decade or at this particular time, is dysfunctional because it can't accommodate global diversity. So most recent theorists have therefore positioned it as a discursive category, most usually in opposition to modernism, but also in opposition to postmodernism. These discursive approaches seem to fall into one of two camps. I hope that didn't move, did it? So either contemporaneity denotes stasis, i.e. it's a continuation of postmodernism's post-historical deadlock, and this would characterize the writing of Boris Groys, for example, but also Peter Osborne, who spoke here last week, and his theory of the contemporary, I think, positions it very much as a continuity of postmodernism, as a historical stasis, with nothing really moving forward. The other type of writing on the contemporary argues that it reflects a break with postmodernism by asserting a plural and disjunctive relationship to temporality. So this would characterize the writing of Giorgio Agamben, for example, or Terry Smith in his book, What is Contemporary Art? I think this latter understanding of the contemporary as a disjunctive form of temporality is more generative, as it allows us to move away both from the historicity of modernism, which was characterized by an abandonment of tradition and a forward propulsion towards the new, and it also allows us to break with the historicity of postmodernism, which was equated in the writings of Jameson and Baudrillard and others with a schizophrenic collapse of past and future into a bloated present that colonizes both. Recent theories of anachronism and the anachronic, which are very popular in art history at the moment, I don't know if you're aware of that. Say, for example, the recent book by Christopher Wood and Alex Nagel called Anachronic Renaissance. So these theories of the anachronic offer a similar emphasis on temporal disjunction. Georges Didier Huberman, for example, has proposed that all works of art have coexisting stratified temporalities. By contrast, what I want to call a dialectical contemporaneity seeks to navigate multiple temporalities within a more political horizon. Rather than simply claim that many or all times are present in each historical object, we need to ask why certain temporalities appear in particular works of art at specific historical moments. Furthermore, this analysis is motivated by a desire to understand our present condition and how we can change it. So lest this method be interpreted as yet another form of presentism, i.e., it's yet more preoccupation with the now, masquerading as historical inquiry, I want to stress that the sightlines are always ultimately oriented towards the future. Where are we going? So the past is never just seen as interesting for its own sake, and the present isn't seen as the rationale for everything, but rather there's a continual dialectical shuttling between the two. So the diagnosis of today requires that we reread history in a different fashion, which in turn will enable us to read the present differently. So where do museums fit into this? My argument is that institutions with a historical permanent collection have become the most fruitful testing ground for a non-presentist, multi-temporal idea of contemporaneity. And this is in direct contrast to the commonplace assumption that the privileged site of contemporary art is the globalized biennial. Of course, for many curators in museums, the historical weight of a permanent collection is an albatross that inhibits the novelty so essential to drawing in new audiences. Temporary exhibitions are always deemed more exciting and profitable than finding yet another way to show the canon. But today, when so many museums are being forced to turn back to their collections because funding has been slashed due to austerity measures, the collection can be the museum's greatest weapon. This is because the permanent collection requires us to think in several tenses simultaneously, the past perfect and the future anterior. The collection is a time capsule of what was once considered culturally significant at previous historical moments, while more recent acquisitions anticipate the judgment of history to come. In the future, this will have been deemed important. So without a permanent collection, it's hard for a museum to stake any meaningful claim to engagement with the past, but also, I would wager, with the future. So one of the reasons for writing this little book is the fact that debates around museum collection hangs haven't really moved on from the debates around the turn of the millennium, which discussed thematic versus chronological. And as you remember, these debates began first at MoMA when it rehung its collection in 1999, and then when Tate rehung both Tate Britain and the newly opened Tate Modern through thematic collection hangs rather than chronology. And this staggers me, that there really hasn't been an art historical discussion of collection hangs since that moment in 2000. But in fact, I think this chronological versus thematic discussion has been displaced by a new paradigm, one that's driven by a sense of present-day social and political urgencies, one that acknowledges specific national traumas, and that stands apart from the presentist model of a contemporary art museum in which trustee and market interests influence what is displayed. The museums I focus on in the book elaborate a dialectical contemporaneity, both as a museological practice and as an art historical method. The most apt term to describe the result of these activities is the constellation, a word used by Walter Benjamin to describe a Marxist project of bringing events together in new ways, disrupting established taxonomies, disciplines, mediums, and proprieties. This approach is, I think, highly suggestive for museums, since the constellation, as a leftist rewriting of history, is fundamentally curatorial. It's about bringing things together in new combinations. And I should maybe just add for art historians in the room that I think the implications of the constellation are also relevant to contemporary art history as it's taught in a university, because it disrupts the formats on which many dissertations depend. You know, the format of the monograph, the ahistorical thematic dissertation, the generational or the geographical survey, and so on. It is, of course, banal and predictable to invoke Benjamin in 2014. But it's striking that his theories have been so influential on visual art, but have had so little impact on the institutions in which art is shown and the histories that it narrates. In his theses on the philosophy of history from 1940, Benjamin draws a distinction between a history spoken in the name of power, which records the triumphs of the victors, and a history that names and identifies the problems of the present day by scouring the past for the origins of this present historical moment. And this, in turn, is the determining motivation for our interest in the past. Benjamin's own Arcades project sought to reflect on Paris, the capital of the 19th century, by juxtaposing found texts, cartoons, prints, photographs, works of art, artifacts, and architecture in poetic constellations. When applied to the museum, this present-minded approach to history suggests a spectator no longer focused on the appreciation of individual works and authors, but one who is aware of being presented with arguments and positions to read or contest. It defetishizes objects by continually juxtaposing works of art with documentary materials, copies and reconstructions, and blurring the lines between all of these. In short, it gives way to an archive of the commons. In art history, it means that contemporaneity becomes less a question of periodization or discourse. That's how it's conventionally understood, especially at my university. Oh, you're the contemporary person, you do art since the 60s. 89, whatever this marking, this sort of arbitrary division is. So instead of being a question of periodization, I think it becomes a method or a practice potentially applicable to all historical periods. Some people will, of course, argue that we can't discard periodization so easily, and in part, these people are right. But I think such an approach also risks condemning previous ages to a remoteness divorced of relevance to the current day, and does nothing to acknowledge the causes of our current presentism, from technology collapsing spatial distance and accelerating our experience of time into a 24/7 on-demand flow of data, to the short-term speculations of finance capitalism, based around fluid abstractions such as currencies, bonds, stocks, and derivatives. All of these affect our spatio-temporal coordinates. For the average person in the West, the future is no longer equated with a hopeful projection into the future, which is what our stereotype of modern historicity is. And I sometimes wonder if that ever really existed. But instead, the future is a pit of anxiety about short-term work contracts, unaffordable healthcare, a lifetime of debt repayments, mortgages and student loans and credit cards. Rather than dealing with this futureless temporality by immersing ourselves in the past, which is, by the way, what I think a lot of contemporary artists are doing in their fascination with the archive at the moment, a tiger's leap into that which has gone before may be supremely relevant to mobilizing an understanding of our situation, as well as seeing afresh the events from whence it emerged. So dialectical contemporaneity, I want to argue, is therefore an anachronic action that seeks to reboot the future through the unexpected appearance of a relevant past. So that's the brief version of what I say in the book. And I guess now it's time to sort of hear from curators and directors, if they have a response to this. I'm going to ask Jesús to come up first, because the Reina Sofia is really one of the core case studies in my book. I think I might just sit. Well, I'd like to look at the pictures as well. Maybe I'll just move around.
We have to connect my PowerPoint. It's not a very comfortable position to use slides. Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, even if it's, it's the first time that I'm the specimen, I'm the object of the. And so instead of being a response, I think it would be more trying to give voice to some of the questions you raised in your article from our own position. That is very specific, and that's what I would like to make clear, that I will speak from our contingent situation, something that probably resists to be classified so easily into categories, because it's something that has to do with a specificity. Even if this doesn't mean that it doesn't, I mean, that it's completely opaque. For instance, 2 weeks ago we were in Ljubljana, in the Moderna Galleria, in Amsterdam, discussing with a network of researchers from all over the place on contemporary and temporalities and strangeness. We are developing an ambitious project, Bojana Piskur, Zdenka, Vladimir and me. It's called Glossary, the Glossary within the International project. That is too ambitious, I would say, after another glossary. Well, again, just to apologize for my English. I don't use it so often anymore, or I don't do it. I don't do it on such occasions. I just do introductions of speakers because I have the job of visitor, and in Reina Sofia. And I must say that 6 years ago I was doing Claire's work. Actually, I was analyzing critically cultural institutions, and then I was abduced by one of them. And so beware. You may become one of us. Okay, 2008. 2008 was a year we, the curatorial team, directed by Manuel Borjaviel, got the position in the Museo Reina Sofia, that you know is a national museum. It's the National Museum of Contemporary Art. It's a monstrous institution, not in the Gerald Raunig term. It's monstrous because it's really big. It's monstrous because that's swallowed. I think it has around 40,000 square meters of exhibition space. We have 500 people. So it's really a monster. And it's a bureaucratic machine, a bureaucratic apparatus that threatens us all. But 2008 is the year of the subprime mortgages crisis, and it's also the year of the Lehman Brothers. And so the word crisis was unavoidable and was our point of departure. So we took this notion of crisis, that is also close to the notion of the contemporary, that we defend, as a kind of leitmotiv. And I cannot think of how could have been our work in these 6 years in the kind of wonderful, expansive moment that was before. I mean, wonderful in inverted commas. So first we start from the notion of the crisis of the institution. Being aware of the inadequacy, the defective, the anachronistic, and obsolescent nature of the institution that fails in identifying a subject, an addressee, beyond the participants of the power structure of the art system or the tourist. You know how this works. So how is the prolongation of the airport? Actually, you know that Schiphol shows artworks in the airport museum. We started thinking of the concept of the museum as zombie. Is a word that became very fashionable at that point. An institution that is not anymore sustained by a plausible representational system and only survives and grows animated by spurious energies, market speculation, gentrification processes, tourism, political propaganda. actually, the extension of museums correspond very much to this zombie growth. Actually, we had to deal, one of the very first things we had to deal with is how to manage this new Jean Nouvel extension that was built or started in 2000, and I think it was opened in 2004, and it was highly used because the former teams didn't know how to use the building itself. So it was completely empty, it was misused, and actually the auditorium were completely useless, were only used for renting, to get money from them. So the thing is that we were arriving in a moment in which there was a crisis in the institution, and a moment in which the museum, as the nation state, as the welfare state, was entering a logic of urgency and contingency, losing its ground, social or any other, as a logic of contingency that made both the state, the national state, and the museum at the same time very fragile and also potentially violent. The museum, as the national state, the public system, is completely dislocated nowadays and cannot recover its former social democrats form. This possibility is a mirage. On Friday we are voting, on Sunday we are voting in Europe for European elections, in which we are supposed to choose between different models of organization, of governance, but probably the possibility of choosing the social democrat, the former welfare state system, is a mirage, as I say. I'll try to look back to 2008 and the moment in which we arrived to the museum. The Reina Sofia Museum, as I said, was endowed, or is endowed, with an enormous and powerful ideological mission to convey the values of modern democratic Spain after Franco's dictatorship. Its collection and its master narrative were originally conceived according to the, by then already obsolete, terms of modernism, as a series of isms arranged according to a linear logic. The Reina Sofia Museum became that way an epigone of the Western modernist logic, although a highly provincial one, except for Guernica and a few pieces by Miró and Dalí, obtained through tax exemptions. Our collection was documenting the local echoes of international avant-gardist movements. Our masters, Picasso, Miró, and Dalí, were diasporic figures whose presence reinforced such a logic. Reina Sofia was to an extent trapped in a version of a center-periphery dynamics that we shared with Western former colonies. Here you have the arrival of Guernica in Madrid in 1981. Actually, a few months after the attempt of coup d'etat that probably marks the end of the Spanish transition, a moment of urgency. Actually, the whole secret process by which MoMA was returning the peace to Spain was threatened by that position because the Picasso family didn't trust Spain. And you see the Guernica that was exhibited in a pavilion near the Prado Museum was framed within a glass urn, an urn that was supposed to protect the painting from the reaction, the aggressions from the right wing. But I would like to see it also the other way. It was also a way to sort of protect the transition process from this extremely powerful image that had been the banner of left-wing militants in Spain and all over the world. There was a process of transubstantiation. If you're Catholic, you know what it is. Through which Guernica stopped being an image of the protest against totalitarianism and violence and the flag of anti-Franco movement to become the image of the Spanish reconciliation and the image of the new Spain. Actually, it's also interesting that the shape of this glass, it looks like an urn. I mean, place a democratic urn. So there was lots of connotations. But what is true is that same year, 1981, you had for the first time the first institution, contemporary art institution in Spain. That is not a museum, it's not a Kunsthalle either, it's actually an art fair. In 1981, Arco, the International Art Fair, opens its doors. And it also provokes a transubstantiation of the role of art, because avant-gardist art in the 60s and 70s had been attached to a great extent to left-wing partisanism, but all of a sudden from 1981 onwards would become would be identified as the top of the capitalist pyramid, and supported obviously by the state. It was financed by the government, both from the right and the left. Well, just a funny comment. This is the signature of Spain becoming part of the European Union in 1984, but it's also the year in which Miquel Barceló paints this trans-vanguard horrible painting that is showing the Spanish impulse, the Spanish identity. That this is a kind of, instead of the bride coming downstairs, it's a wolf, male wolf coming upstairs. That's a Spanish bravura. And Reina Sofia was created as a museum in 1992, the year of the Olympic Games and the Expo in Seville, that coincides with the spectacularization of culture in Spain. Okay, so it's basically what we had when we arrived, in a declining mood because the whole project had been declining. Okay. Well, there were small Reina Sofias appearing all over Spain. And this is a funny work of art of a critical artist that reproduced this image of, that was the symbol of Reina Sofia, and populated all of Spain with these images, taking the Roman names of Spanish populations instead of the names of the contemporary nations like the Basque or the Catalans, saying that you could, quoting Pliny, a Roman author, said that you could jump from one museum to another museum without putting your foot on the ground. And that was also clear what was the role of art in Spanish democratic society. Okay. So our main task then, when we arrived, was to break that modernist logic in order to release the narrative potential of a collection which urgently demanded to be read or reinscribed from a new perspective that recognized the significance of any artistic form in the specific context. In order to do so, we need to be able to renounce to our previous certainties and to our well-established values, and to take the risk of losing ourselves, losing our identity as a museum. The first thing to do was to problematize the notion of modernity. Our central theme, the central theme of the museum, we couldn't escape. The problem of modernity had to be displayed as a cacophony, as a contested field. Progress and social conflicts, technology and propaganda, individual curiosity and state control. As Francisco de Goya revealed, modernity is always chased by monsters, by nightmares in which fears and disordered desires appears. Regression, reaction, nostalgia, skepticism provided a grotesque and carnivalesque counterpart to the ideology of progress in 20th century Spain. And that's the way we start our collection, with this complex and uncontested notion of modernity. But immediately after this problematization of modernity, we had to forget proper names. That was our second sin. We had to forget Picasso, we have to forget Miró, and we have to forget Dalí. Our visitors were used to recognize the genius of these masters from beginning to the end, as if the artists were identical to themselves since their early works to their deaths. From then onwards, from now, they should be found scattered through all the museum, in different contexts and with different meanings, some of them not particularly comfortable. As it happened to the Picasso's Blue Lady of 1900, that we paired with Belle Époque symbolism uncanny representations of women, which revealed the troubled position of the male subject when facing the new century and the new role claimed by women. Dalí's woman seen from the back stands now very much as a conventional male voyeuristic image when displayed beside the wonderful imaginary world of his contemporary, the forgotten woman artist, Ángeles Santos. Strategically forgetting the name of the genius male artist allowed us to bring to light the many names of a multitude of silenced boys as Ángeles Santos, many of them women, many visions, many experiences which do not provide a new totality, but rather open up a world without boundaries. Actually, this wonderful painting of 1929 was on storage, since it was in the collection. It had never been displayed, and now it's displayed just side by side Dalí's woman. Thirdly, the third problem was the autonomous status of the work of art and the hierarchical position of the masterpiece, which reproduces the canonical structure of power systems as much as the reverence of the male genius does. We believe, especially our director, believes in the poetic power of art, but we consider as our role to release that aesthetic poetic potential, but without forgetting that works of art, cultural artifacts, have other meanings and functions that work as documents or as political statements, which are equally relevant and impossible to separate from the former. This lack of respect for the conventional notion of the masterpiece allowed us to combine the traditional genres of painting and sculpture with cinema, photography, graphic arts, documents, allowing multiple combinations in which a painting may play a documentary role beside a photograph playing an aesthetic statement, blurring the differences between these roles. These meanings and functions can be and should be modulated through narrative strategies, obviously, by plotting from the present. And instead of the linear narrative of the modernist colonial canon, we try to display multiple narratives which imply multiple genealogies. These narratives sometimes overlap and sometimes contradict each other. Most of them are time and space specific. The local is not a synonym of closure and constraint in this context. Quite the opposite. The local is identified as a crossroad, as a situation in which decisions are made and positions are taken. The local reveals a subject position, a point of view. And to conclude, and to wrap up a bit, and to also to introduce some critique, this obviously seems to work quite well in terms of discourse. A discourse addressed to an audience that, although heterogeneous and in permanent mutation, represents global affluent classes. The current condition requires thus a new près de parole, paraphrasing Desacto, a new, different subject, but it also involves the crisis of the modern notion of the citizen and a new kind of social governance and a destabilization of the traditional role of cultural institutions, especially in Europe. But no exhibition, as we conceive them, and no collection display may respond on its own to this new situation. What an exhibition can do in this sense is to visualize the problem as addressed by artists who, like in the Emperor's new dress, are not scared of telling the truth. The museum should thus become a platform to rehearse imaginative forms of relationality. But this cannot be done in the mere realm of aesthetics or in the world of images or narratives, since autonomy is not anymore a given in the arts, but a goal that requires a radical critique of institutional bases and the performance of new logics and new protocols. But obviously, and that thing is that the conclusive and for me the most important point, is that the institution, the museum, cannot do this alone, and cannot do it only as part of a self-reflection. But it has to be done as part of a broader critique of institutionality and be connected to the instituent dynamics of society as a whole. The institution must take the risk to challenge its own principles, and first of all, to suspend the monopoly in the management and definition of heritage. The notion of heritage is the basis of the capitalist nation-state as well as the notion of canon. It is urgent to imagine thus and produce a new kind of legacy that does not have legitimate heirs, widows and sons. I mean, people in museums are always dealing with widows and sons. But the thing is, we have to get rid of this idea of that we, who are the legitimate heirs of this. Obviously, if we are not the legitimate heirs of a collection, of a heritage, we should imagine and invent new sorts of narratives. We should invent and imagine a sort of legacy that is not related to property, in Spanish patrimonio, that comes to patri, to father, to what belongs to your father, or exclusive genetics. We should claim the legacy of the bastards and that of lovers. Actually, somebody said that actually lovers were the real artists, and not the artists themselves. The legacy of anybody, disregarding national frontiers or the flux of global capital. Well, I think there's been a corruption in the PowerPoint, but never mind. This happens when you transfer from Mac to. But basically, I think actually I feel more comfortable not showing images of this, because this attempt at escaping this notion of heritage is something that we've been rehearsing with the Red Conceptualismo del Sur that Isabel knows very well. It's a network of researchers, activists, and artists from different parts of Latin America, mainly, but not only, but also from Spain and also Britain, that claim or protest and denounce the appropriation and especially this appropriation of the artistic heritage of the 60s and 70s and 80s political art in Latin America, that is being systematically bought, acquired by metropolitan institutions, especially from the States, but not only. But they are not claiming that they are the legitimate heirs. They are trying also to rehearse a new way of relating to heritage, one that is not related to property, and one that is always related to the contemporary. They think or they consider these artworks or these artifacts as mainly as elements that had to be activated from the present, and not only that, but that had to activate the present. I think today or yesterday, the exhibition of Perder la Forma Humana, curated collectively by the Red Conceptualismo del Sur, with the support of Reina Sofia, was opened in Buenos Aires. Obviously, dealing with these subjects, with the network, is always requires negotiation, tensions. I mean, it requires attention that is always about to break. I mean, the relationship between Reina Sofia and the network and the Red Conceptualismo del Sur is being always fragile, as it should be. Because otherwise, we would instrumentalize them, or they would just use us for budget. And apart from the Red Conceptualismo del Sur, we are also discussing with other agents. I have brought some images from the Fundación de los Comunes. It's a network of activist movements all over the Spanish state that are imagining a new sort of institutionality. They are imagining beyond us. They are imagining an institution that somehow is based on a new instituent dynamics. Yeah, it's done. Yeah. And the thing is that Reina Sofia, in this process of self-reflection, of self-critique, we are introducing these agents that do not recognize us as the only conveyors of institutionality, that claim that a new institutionality should be imagined. And in the discussion, in the negotiation with them, we try to open up a new space that is not anymore the former space of activism, but is breaking some fractures in the structure of the old institution, so that some life comes into the zombie, some life enlivens the institution that is taking otherwise relationship only with financial power and with processes of urban transformation. And this is always, again, a tension. It involves always a negotiation. And I think that I will leave that as the main, or the main theme of my intervention. And this also relates to education. The main challenge of institutions nowadays is how much they can negotiate with society, and second, how much they can learn from it. I think that is something that is probably a good way of inverting or reverting the traditional role of museums as educational institutions. I think the main challenge of our institutions now is how much we can learn from the transformations that are taking place in society. Thank you very much, and sorry for being probably too long.
So thank you very much for having me here. It will be a completely different example of an institution that the one that Jesús introduced. That's why I'm really extremely pleased to be here among the other guests. And it's extremely stressful to speak in English in front of the British audience, so forgive me all mistakes. So, as Isabel introduced, I'm coming from the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, and which is from among the 3 institutions and 5 institutions with the institutions that are not present here but are present in the book. The youngest, the smallest, and probably the most modest institution. It was established in 2005, and since 2007 the team under Joanna Mytkowska, whom I'm replacing tonight, started the work on the program, on the collection, and since then we tried to imagine the institution that could like be an alternative to the institutions we know so far. So a very quick introduction. So the Museum of Modern Art is the first art museum to be built in the city of Warsaw, so in the capital, since 1938. The building, which is due to open, like it was due to open in 2012, then in 14, then in 16, and now in 19. So it's really a very difficult project, will stand in front of Poland's most emblematic structure, the Palace of Culture and Science. You can see in the very center, so this red shape is the future building of the museum. So the Palace of Culture was erected in 1955 in the Moscow-style skyscraper and is regarded by some as a symbol of Soviet domination, by others as simply a unique Warsaw landmark. The palace thus serves as literal backdrop or foil, emphasizing the new museum's contextualization within a fundamental cultural shift that has been taking place in Poland. And emancipated from historical encumbrances and in the process of democratization that has been accelerating since the collapse of communism, contemporary culture and visual arts in particular has now just found an internationally comprehensive language for describing the transformation and the new social phenomenon accompanying it. The critical methods developed by artists throughout the late 80s and 90s, but strongly linked to the 60s and 70s practices of participatory methods defined, for example, by the Polish theoretician and architect Oskar Hansen, I will get back to that name later, can now be used to test the social taboos, examine social frustrations, and create a climate of openness for critical discourse. So this is a very short introduction to show you also like the place where the museum is going to be built. So, but as I said, this museum and this structure in the very center of Warsaw is still a dream for us. It is a very difficult project because, as you could see in the plan of Warsaw, this is like the most central space in the city of Warsaw. So, and in the meantime, we are and waiting for the future spaces. We are working in the former furniture shop, which is this space. The building that hosts Warsaw Museum of Modern Art was built in the 70s, and we are using it for 7 years now. It is one of the few great and utterly beautiful functional buildings of the socialist era that are still existing in Warsaw. Most of the others have been torn down in the last years to give way for the erection of Warsaw's 21st century turbo capitalist skyline. It is a real pity that this city wants to actively get rid of all evidences that Poland had a socialist past, because especially the buildings of the socialist late modernism define a certain cultural identity. And obviously, this identity will be step by step lost with every demolition. In fact, our museum is awaiting demolition as well. The museum will need a new space by 2016. As I said, the big museum is going to be there somewhere in between 2019 and 20. Talking about Warsaw means talking about identity. That's why I showed you this image of where we are and about losing identity. Almost the whole city was destroyed during the Nazi occupation, and the socialist architects were some of the few to give the city a new identity. The rest were attempts to rebuild the old medieval city. Even the city's ancient castle has been rebuilt shortly after the war. One of the main issues in Warsaw is, what is the city? Who owns the city? In this sense, I wanted to show you a few images. I will go very quickly through them by two artists, researchers, Elżbieta Janicka and Wojciech Wilczek, from 2011. They are doing a series of photos of Warsaw taken from along the former ghetto wall. I will show you the images. The former ghetto wall. So this is only from around the city, just to give you the image of how it is. This is the very, very center of Warsaw. So they are creating these images that I show you. They are creating an amazing image of the city that documents at least three omnipresent layers of the city. The war, communist socialist realism, and turbo-capitalism. You could see like different stages. And looking at these photos, you realize that these layers are never meeting. The tension becomes obvious. Only an opportunist would call it dynamic. In fact, there is a battle raging about who is owning the city. And this is a very important context for the museum I'm coming from. So in this multi-layered, very material landscape, apart from identificational or organizational questions, you can imagine how imposing is the question of time, and this few crucial for our institution. How to be in one's own time? What does it mean to be contemporary? How can the institution grasp and identify the present moment? How and if can it shape it? Our institution is very small compared to Reina, Sofia and many other museums, but when I was starting in 2007, we were only two with Jana Metkowska, the director, and right now we are 20, and I have the impression that it's really a crowd already, and it's a huge institution. So as I said, we have a team only of 20 people, and for us it's also a fight to survive. When the government created our institution, they actually had a completely different museum in mind. They wanted a museum to represent the new neoliberal Poland. They wanted to see spectacular contemporary art in a spectacular museum building, preferably built by Zaha Hadid, because that's the only famous architect they could know at this moment. But in fact, the international competition was won by the Swiss minimalist architect Christian Keres, which led to a major crisis in the city. The reason was obvious. The city wanted the new Museum of Modern Art to be built directly in the front of the Palace of Culture, the city landmark, building in the heart of Warsaw, as I said. It turned out that there was no concept for such a building when the competition was set. And when I say that this institution is about witnessing the transformation, I want to add that this museum has become a place of open discussions. We have become, in the meantime, I will show you some images of what we actually do. But we really, in these 7 years, we have become a real forum with these questions, like what is the role of contemporary culture? What is the role of the museum? What is the role of its collection? What image does it give of the society and the present moment? Can it actually shape this image? Because as I told you, this will be the first art museum to be built in Warsaw from before the war. And in the meantime, many museums were actually created, but the historical museum. So there was no problem of this auto-identification, of this question of where we are, who we are, and how we want to be, and what kind of image of ourselves do we want to give to ourselves and the outside. So in our auditorium that you will see in this, this is the first, like the collection. I will show you the. So just one thing about the auditorium and the discussion. We discuss really the current political agenda of the major, and we are discussing social housing. So like all topics about Warsaw, about identification, about identity, about the collection, this is all mixed. 7 years ago when we started, we were fully aware that even though we had the best connections, we were still isolated from the city and also from the world. But step by step, year by year, we've built up a reputation within the city, and we have become a gathering point in the city and a place where ideas are being born, discussed, and developed. And so we were invited here to speak about the contemporary and the collections. So as I said, the museum was established only in 2005. So since together with Joanna Mitkowska, we are there. So since 2007, we are gathering very slowly the collection, and it is in a relatively short time the institution has acquired over 300 works. So it's nothing compared to Reina Sofia, but somehow there's a certain, it's a wonderful situation to shape actually the collection, to really think actively what do we want to have in the collection, how do we think the collection, what should it reflect. And we started the collection with this crucial idea, which was to provide access and discuss the statements made by contemporary artists, particularly those whose work described the social changes and the emancipatory movements in Poland after '89. By this collection wants to shed new light on the Polish experience of political and economic transition, as well as its moral, ethical, and social repercussions, and describe the artistic phenomena which accompanied change in Central and Eastern Europe during the second half of the 20th century. But this is the big project, and then there are few reservations. So this collection tries to examine ties between art, cities, politics, and history in the search for visions of the future and new interpretations of the past. So even if most of the artworks have been created in recent years for the benefit of a certain historical context, we also present examples of Polish art created around '68, a breakthrough year in terms of the shape of the contemporaneity. By this, we are able to show the roots of modernity, as well as the approaches of charismatic 20th century artists like Alina Szapocznikow or Andrzej Wróblewski that were created in the 60s and 70s, who are still an inspiration to contemporary art practitioners and theoreticians. So there's a certain non-linear way of putting the history and the present, and we also try to decentralize as much as possible. So in the beginning, the idea for the museum was to define and exhibit crucial attitudes and trends in Polish art. But our intention is to underline that the international character of the art and culture of today is really global. So for that reason, we wanted to confront the Polish viewers with the global art phenomena, particularly since the social changes of today stretch far beyond the local. This is why our collection doesn't privilege Polish art, but shows it as an element in the global circulation of art. In the collection, there are 50% of Polish artists, and 50% of international artists, and 50% of women, and 50% of men. This is like the policy that we are trying to see in broader perspective. So, and in Poland, this is like a completely new, because never before have works from by non-Western artists, including artists from Egypt, Mexico, Israel, and Libya, being so prominent in the Polish modern art collection. By this, the collection refers to what we can call the parallel localities. So try to decentralize as much as possible, as I said. Universal history has also been recorded and enshrined in canonical artworks. So the museum collection is founded on the relation between modernity and artistic output today. So the questions as what do works of art tell us about the world outside, beyond the autonomous zone of the museum, are very important for us. What responsibilities and tasks do artists have towards society? What is the relationship between modern day audiences and the artworks in the museum? And how long does modernity last before it turns into history? So as you know, like the working with contemporary art collection is very often the gambling. We have to try to imagine the future of the works, and very often we can think that we can be mistaken, but somehow we try to reflect actively and work with artists like about the definition of the present moment. So far at the museum we had only 2 shows of the collection. Smaller elements of the collection were shown internationally and in some other spaces in Warsaw, but this is the poster of the first show of the collection, and this is the work that accompanied this poster, a work by Ahlam Shibli, the Palestinian artist that she produced in Warsaw in the with the children from without homes. So how do you call it? Homeless children. Yeah. Okay. So the first show of the collection was called "In the Heart of the Country," and it was the museum's Warsaw largest exhibition project to date. It reflected the full scale and scope of the museum institution's venture, and it presented over 150 exhibits. So in this furniture shop, we try to turn into a proper museum. We shown 150 works, and there were a few intersecting themes, such as globalization of art history, links between cities and contemporary art, emancipatory narratives in art, questions of memory and history, language and the ethics of modernity, socially engaged artists. So there were a few different ways of dealing with this collection. And the exhibition's title was derived from Keats's hallucinatory novel, in which the heart of the country is a whole, a void, an insatiable phantasm of physical fulfillment and maturation, of the identity, body, and community spirit. In the context of the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, the title relates to the institution's planned location, Plac de Fila, the Parade Square, next to the Palace of Culture, an inhospitable gap in the center of the capital, as well as to a yearning for modernization, which often turns artists and art institutions into mortal hostages. So maybe you know this novel by John Keats, really like this description of the heart of the country as a whole, as nothing, and so we thought that it would maybe make us think more actively about this future actualization of the museum, because as you know, like as I said, this is like a certain like impossible project for us somehow. I will show you the work by Paweł Althammer that is showing also the effort to make this institution happen. So the current, okay, so I will show you just a few images from this show, and I will tell you a few words about the second show and the current show of the collection, and I'm done. Yeah, very quickly. So just to show you some images and how do we deal. Gośka Macuga's work, Paulina Ołowska, here Piotr Ukraiński, Libera, Żana Kadrowa. And this is the work I wanted to tell you about. You probably know this this method that Paweł Alcano is now playing with. So this is the work that he called the bark howlers, and this is a piece inspired. Like Paweł Alcano was inspired by museum's own current situation, a constant struggle to build its own buildings. So you can see that we are pulling the model of the impossible building. So this building will never happen. And this is Jana Metkowska, this is the accountant, this is myself, you know. He just took our faces and then this impossibility of building the museum. So this effort, and this is, as you know, as you maybe recognize, but probably not, but this is the relation to the well-known painting by berg howlers on the Volga from 1873 by Ilya Repin. So one of the first Russian realists to couple realistic representation with the affinity for the common people. So this is Sarah Lucas in relation to Bracha Ettinger, and next to Alina Szapocznikow, the Polish pioneer artist that we are working on. And this is the work that served as a title for our second and current show of the collection, Sharon Hayes in the New Future, that focuses on the change. Like this show focuses on the change in culture that has been introduced by emancipative equality discourses which blur the traditional borders and hierarchies, in particular in terms of the notions of gender, family, religion, nation, race, or public space. So we've borrowed this title from Sharon Hayes, who studies contemporary social movements and their aspirations of liberations. The museum in Warsaw still is in process of becoming, and it tries to follow Hayes in her belief in the establishment of new ideas and practices which are at the same time the foundation of the contemporary culture. Okay, so a few images from this show. So again, Sarah Lucas in relation again to Szapocznikow, but then Miriam Kahn, the Swiss artist on the other side, Paulina Ołowska, Miłosław Bałka, the artist from the 80s. We are trying to link all these emancipatory narrations with the Polish 80s, where there was only like this hope for the change that happened in '89. Okay, so very quickly. Lynette Yadombukie, that you know, the British Nigerian artist with Szapocznikow, Thomas Hirschhorn and Rafał Bujnowski, Wilhelm Sasna. And this is, okay, so very, very quickly to just finish, and how do we work with this collection, and how we are trying not only to make it contemporary and make it accessible to our public, not only by its narration, but also in a special program that accompanies every single show, and especially the shows of the collection. So we have the program that is called the Open Museum, that derives inspiration from Oscar Hansen, the architect and the theoretician of the open form, where open forms. He had this idea in '59, and we are trying to take from this idea the emphasis that is placed in the collaborative learning process, and supplanting the traditional hierarchical process of importing knowledge. Like around the in the heart of the country, the first show of the collection, and the first so important work was made with an owned collection. So here, for the first time when we were showing the collection, our program was trying to answer these three important questions, like when does the present become history, how to describe the past in order to not to lose track of its timeless potential, and how to preserve an active attitude both toward the past and the present in order to be able to shape and comprehend them in a conscious manner. And there was a very fruitful, I'm finishing, just last few words, very fruitful and very inspiring for us a series that we called the Exercises in Timeliness, where we were trying to ask the question, but also to this question of being in and living in one's own time. So Terry Smith was there, opening with an open discussion, but we had really quite an amazing series of talks where we were trying to answer these questions of alternative languages, of art, and how to think the old and the new, and how the old can become new, and when is the new, if the contemporary art can be old already, when, even if it's created in front of us. So the last edition of Open Museum was devoted to the latest installment of the exhibition of the collection, and it was a program of meetings that accompanied the exhibition, and it was an attempt to build the broad context, historical, social, and cultural, for the key questions about the manners and forms of individual and social empowerment. And so just these few images to show you, this is the auditorium. This is the auditorium with the public, and people coming. And the auditorium also serves, because as a former furniture shop, we have to always adapt. So this is the performance, the reconstruction of the performance from New York by Paulina Orłowska, The Alphabet. Trevor Harrell. We also have the sculpture garden outside of in the other side of the with works by Dziewanska, Olafur Eliasson. Some books.
Okay, I'm going to stop this because
it's fine.
Supposed to end now, but
I'm sorry.
It's very. I'm going to make a big sweeping statement. It's really hard to get curators and artists to speak in 15 minutes because it always goes on. So we're already losing people. I'm really sorry. Francesco, step up there and do it quickly.
Well, I'm going to do it from here if it's okay with the microphone. So I will keep it as brief as possible because I might want to sit down.
Is that one you're in?
No, it's that one. The last one. Here we go. What I want to talk to you about is a new approach that we are experimenting at Tate Liverpool. So I'm not talking for the full Tate and the National Institution. And I will tell you a little bit about what our concerns have been and how we've been trying to resolve them. And to start with, I just love using these images in a variety of situations because this is the sort of fictional reconstruction of the first institution that was called the Museum. And that was at the library in Alexandria, and it was a place where philosophers and people thinking geometry or all sorts of branches of the knowledge that was being constructed then were giving their seminars, and they were meeting there in order to generate new knowledge collectively between them and also with students and people that they would work with. The reason why I like this is that I really very much like talking about the museum and its likeness to the archive, also in parallel to its potential likeness to the library, and the fact that this was a library where people were generating knowledge using existing knowledge, and you can see in the image. I'm just going to point out with a mouse here. There's like a repository of knowledge here, and the knowledge is being discussed, and then, and then what is generated by that discussion goes back into this archive or the sort of collection, if we go with this metaphor. So the reason why I'm showing you this is that this is the way that I would like the museum to function. This is the way that I'm trying to push the museum to function as a place, very much like Jesús said earlier. I like to use another expression, which is the museum as a learning machine. In connection to his concern that we should learn from people. The museum should become a machine that learns with the audience and learns with the users of the museum rather than a television that transmits the knowledge out. So this is the reason why I use this image in particular. The way that we started working with the collection a couple of years ago was precisely using the metaphor of constellations that Claire evoked earlier, coming from Benjamin and Adorno, using it as a way of bringing together things from different situations. And the other inspiration in relation to the constellation was something that I took from Buckminster Fuller, the visionary architect from the 60s, because he was talking about the constellation as the one in the sky. And I've got a quote here. He says, "These stars are enormous distance in space and time, one behind the other, or even in the same constellation. But from where you and I happen to sit, they've got that appearance." So the interesting aspect of the metaphor that Benjamin and Adorno were using is really the spatial temporal distribution in the sky of these elements that they brought together, and the fact that only from the Earth they are visible as this particular shape that the constellation assumes. So thinking about this and in relation to the use of the collection and the use of a collection in a museum as an archive, I was thinking about how can we look at works that have been generated in different contexts, which have been geographical context or historical context, and look at them from a particular standstill. So I started thinking and elaborating on this idea of the simultaneity of the relevance of the work and how we can look at work that might come from different periods, might come from different situations, but looked at them from today, from the contemporary, they actually are completely simultaneous. And the way that we constructed this was started reflecting on the Tate collection. Before I get into this, I just want to tell you a little bit about this work, which is the work that introduces the collection display. It's a work by Carolyn Evans that is currently in the foyer in the entrance at Tate Liverpool. And the interesting element, hidden element of this work is that it transmits out, like the one that you got here, Alex, it transmits out a book which is called Astrophotography, the Traditional Measure of Photographic Speed in Astronomy. And I like this because it's a book that essentially traces the history of how do we look at constellations once the photography originates, and how we can see much more constellations through the photographic medium. But the interesting part of the history of this medium is that in the early years, some of these photographs were then printed out, and because the negative had like a speck on it, there were stars being named and new constellations being invented that were originated by this random machine process of printing out what was captured by the telescope. So this incorporation of the error and this incorporation of how images emerge from darkness is something that I found quite evocative in relation to what we did. So we work with the curatorial team, and the way to originate constellations that we came up with was to think of a selection of triggers that would go through the collection historically from the beginning of the century. So we started with Matisse, but we got Picasso, and then carry on through decade by decade, trying to balance out geographical component of these triggers, and then also balance out the gender balance in this particular group. Then we isolated the trigger, and each of the work was used to generate a set of connections across history and across geography that would look at how some concerns that were elaborated in the first trigger work, or some particular formal advancements that were reached by the work, or any other sort of elective affinity, could be mapped out, and in particular in different directions. So it wasn't the point that we were trying to do to create a sort of coherent group, but it was precisely to create an incoherent group. And this is in particular because what I was interested in trying to represent was not what curatorial strategy normally encapsulates the idea of coherence, but ruptures and ruptures in history, and how, in order to avoid the linearity of the traditional canonical art history, ruptures are the moment in which something happens that helps define more than one problem at the same time. So we use this incoherence as a tool to really reflect of this incompatible coexistence of modernities in different places, in different way of manifesting themselves, and we use this principle of simultaneity that I was telling you earlier, and the idea of trying to map out certain synchronicity that would collectively and dialectically connect the work selected to the present, to the situation in which we are looking them from today. This is one example. These are the works that form the constellation originating around the Man Ray piece, which is in the center left of the image. The other aspect that I found particularly inspiring from Benjamin and Adorno's use of the constellation metaphor was the idea of the constellation being a spatial, temporal, and perceptual concept. Something that, as Claire talked about earlier, can organize disparate information in a way that allows for a problem or for something really quite important to become more visible. Benjamin defined constellation as thought concepts, so that the relationship of set elements allow this greater visibility. And the fact that we combined this with incoherence was really trying to set up a machine that put in visibility not just one element, but a multiplicity of ideas, possibly contradicting each other as well. The way that we visualize this is by literally using graphic design, that we use real constellations and put names instead of star names, so that people could get into this idea and this method in an intuitive way. And this is the way that we installed the constellation that I was showing earlier, the one around Man Ray. You can see several work. There's a Cristo here, but there's a painting by Paul Nash. There's a Marcel Duchamp here, a wheel of a Simon Starling. So this gives you an idea of the breadth of the historical sweep, and also of the different kind of connections that set in motion from originating from a single work. The way that then we organized the interpretation was to assign to each of the works in the constellation tag words. So we assigned some keywords to each of the work, between 3 and 5 keywords, which were part of the label in the interpretation scheme. And we tried to make this word as overlapping as possible. So there were some words that were shared by different works. And therefore we came up with this set of word clouds. I'm sure you're all familiar with this system in which the more you quote a single word, the more the bigger the size of the font it is. So it gives a sort of authority or some sort of prominence. And this is exactly what I was trying to identify as something that is the thought image coming out of the constellation. So there's not just one single idea, there's a multiplicity of ideas that come out of it and battle for visibility in some way. The instability of this meaning was really pushing forward this idea of that I was trying to elaborate, of reverse curating. Normally when you create a collection display, especially whether it's like a traditional one using canonical art history movements or a Tate modern one to use a shortcut which is based on a theme, you start with a theme, so whether it is futurism or the body, and then you fit underneath that a variety of works that fit the sort of theme. So it's a sort of top-down kind of way. While we started with the work, and then we started to not really come to a sort of single word, but we originated the title of these displays by looking at the works and allowing for the constellation image to emerge. What I was also adamant to do was, and here you see it in one of the rooms in the Matisse, how it appears on the wall. On the top there's the visualization of the constellation, there's a text explaining the main work, and then this word cloud coming out underneath as the guide to look at the work around you. But I was particularly interested in not just doing this from the authorial position of the museum, but also trying to find a way of working with our audience and generating new constellation images from the series of works that we selected with members of the general public. So we selected, as an experiment a couple of months ago, this constellation around Marina Abramovich's Rhythm Zero, which is the work that you see in this image on the background. And we work with a group of 12, or probably more like 15 people, to re-tag every single work and to see whether there were different ideas emerging from the constellations that we proposed them to look at. And this is what we got. The top one is the word cloud that was originated by our team, so by the museum, the sort of authority or the expert, while the bottom one was the one that was originated from a discussion with the public. And this is really the kind of way in which I'm trying to push the idea of the learning machine. How can we learn with the public how to look at certain particular works of art? And another way in which this experimental pushes that we've been trying to bring it to fruition has manifested itself is in an exhibition which was based on the collection, an exhibition that just closed some 3 or 4 weeks ago called Keywords. And this show was inspired by the work, by a book that Raymond Williams wrote in '76, which is a book that looks at how the fluctuation of language makes possible for words to change meaning across history and for certain words to become particularly prominent and important in a particular historical time. So inspired by that book, we put together a selection of works from the collection, in particular from the 80s, and it's a generation of works of artists in the 80s, such as, for example, Rose English, or Anne Talentire, Stuart Brisley, or Joe Spence, who were never, some of which were never really been shown that often, and some have never been shown since acquisition, precisely because we wanted to track the book coming out in '76 and the end of 20 years after of the Thatcher government. So really a certain particular generation, critical generation, working in a certain political condition in this country. The way that one of the critics defined it in a way that we never really consciously phrased before was like, well, this is great. This is a generation of people who were obscured by the YBA. And that's quite interesting for me, because it really has to do with this idea of trying to rewrite history by using different kind of mechanism to create display. The way that this display work, you can see in the images, is that we had Will Holder and Luca Frey, an artist and a designer, coming with a proposal for the display, and they designed these large words that you see on the background, which were 13 words selected from the book. And these words were loosely associated with groupings of work. In this case, you see that there's a carpet that unifies a section of work. And in this composition of images that I've done, I just wanted to give you a sense of the idea that deambulating across the exhibition would put a work and a word in relation, different words and works in relation to each other according to where you were standing. So, for example, theory on this image is in front of this work, but then as soon as you move is in front of this other one, and vice versa. The same work can belong to or can interact and sort of generate new meanings by these sort of sidelines in which things are associated differently. I think this is the other side of the exhibition, in which Luca and Will just designed this poster wall, which was meant to be some sort of protest wall, a wall that was mimicking the idea of like fly posting and using collection words as a sort of collection works as groups or constellations again that would stand in front of particular words that were painted onto the normal wall of the gallery. I'll conclude now just by one further reflection on the idea of collections. And the reason why I am so interested in trying to work with the public differently is that one of the questions that Isabel asked at the beginning was, how do you treat national collection? How do you represent the nation? And how do you represent national identity? I think the way that we should think national collection is again debunking the notion of ownership. It has to do with this idea that, yes, these are legally owned by the public, but I think, and I really believe that the mission of the museum is to transform the legal ownership into an emotional ownership. So the moment in which the museum works properly is when you bring together the objects and people and create a link between them. I hope I was quick enough.
Can I get the speakers to come back? Isabel, how much time do we have?
Well,
Not much.
I was going to say,
none.
stating the obvious, it's 1:15 and we
people
were
have to go
billed to
home, yeah?
finish at 8.
Eventually.
What do the audience want? Do they want to ask questions, or do you just want to go home? Because I don't want to keep you here under duress, but okay, now's your moment to escape if you need to go. Okay, so I'm going to just ask each one of the panelists a question, and then hopefully they'll be faster than they were during their
I think if we-
presentations, and
if
we'll have
we-
time for something from the audience. Yeah?
If we aim to finish around 1:30,
Is that all right? Like 12 minutes?
and it'll be 22, but it'll be closer to 1:30 than 9.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I won't delay it further.
Okay, okay, maybe I'll start with Francesco because this is freshest in my mind. Francesco, could you do? Several things come to mind when you're describing what you're doing with the collection hangs in Tate Liverpool. One is, firstly, I would love to hear you do a self-critique of the constellation displays and maybe the limitations of tagging or what you feel can come out of this re-tagging of works. Whether and how this is going to affect future hangs or motivations of the collection. But also connected to that is whether you think that the kind of shows that you're doing at Tate Liverpool, like Art Turns Left or the Keywords show, are things that you could not do in London, and that the freedom that you have to do these kind of exhibitions is contingent on your position in Liverpool and not being the centre and symbolically identified with the national hub, the big tourist magnet that is Tate Modern.
I think I'll reply in reverse. I think it has a lot to do with not being in the center, the freedom that we have, and not just the freedom, but the focus that we have. I think that in a city like Liverpool, having a national museum, having a sort of outpost, begs for a connection between what the social and political landscape of the public is in Liverpool and the institution. Liverpool has 450,000 inhabitants, and the museum has like 600,000 visitors a year. But I think that because of the size of Tate Liverpool and because of what Liverpool has been historically, and because the characters of the Liverpudlians who are very opinionated and vocal in their opinions, I think it's particularly interesting in experimenting with making of the museum not just a public intellectual, but a public intellectual that is done collectively with the community that is locally owning that institution. So I think Keywords is part of that as well. It's part of that experiment in which we try to make a museum that bring the constituencies of the users and transform them into partners, into people that we collaborate with. And I think that is the direction. It's certain that we have less pressure and visibility because of the tourists, but we do have tourism as well, because we are used to attract people.
Sure. Okay, and what about the constellation?
And the constellation, I think, again, the self-critique would be that there needs to be a bit more focus on where the problems are in these constellations. I don't think that just starting from a trigger work that then generates a set of problems is enough. I think that it needs to be a bit more provocative and a bit more focused on how certain questions are relevant today. So we can't rely just on the works bringing up things.
This history, I mean, my criticism is that one loses a sense of any historical narrative through that, and that at its most open-ended, it seems more akin to an artist-curated exhibition of sort of intuitively felt connections between works, rather than the sense of wanting to like retell a history from a certain position.
Definitely yes, and I think that even just sort of fleshing out some of these things would be a way of addressing this. Like, you know, the Abramovich thing, you can definitely address certain things that come out of the Abramovich intervention and that tradition becoming questions.
Yeah. So it was interesting in the public's word cloud, feminism seemed to completely disappear.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we experimented, for example, in Anthony Left was like to turn wall panels into questions and actually not providing answers to those questions, but like getting people to reflect on those. I think we need to focus more on which are these problems that dialectically emerge, rather than just leave it all in the moment.
Yeah. Okay, Marta, I'm going to work backwards from the panel. I was interested in the way in which you broke down your sort of rationale for collecting new works for this new museum into 50-50 Polish, international, male and female. And I can see that the acquisition of works by it feels as if there are more works by female artists who also fall into the international category than local. It feels like the local history is perhaps more male than female. But still, I'm wondering, like, what is the rationale for which countries you're looking to? Because once you open it up to international, it could be anything in the world. And I guess I want to push you on being more specific about where and why you're looking at. You talked about, was it parallel, not parallel peripheries, what was it? Parallel localities. Parallel localities. Because I think a counterpoint, it's at risk of being read as Poland also wanting to position itself as a global player. Yeah? Look, we've got Polish works, which is half the collection, but equally we've got a global collection, and see these works can compete with each other. So I can also see the museum fulfilling the national requirements of the requirements of the government for national representation as a global player. So.
Yeah. So no. So like the most important thing is that, as I said in the beginning, like the 89 is somehow like this central moment for our collection. And when we think about acquiring other works from other countries or international works from elsewhere, it's always like to deal with other experiences of transformation. So that's why Israel is so close to us, because there's also this like idea of modernization, and South America. And if we, for example, I shown you the work by Sarah Lucas, is that we are doing a research and we are trying to compare Polish 90s, which were completely different than the British YBA movement. Like, it's always like trying to relate.
Why? What has the British YBA got to do with
No,
anything that Poland was done through the 90s?
Like there are some, some small points that you can always like research on, and I think that this is like somehow a very interesting thing, and this is exactly like how do I read Walter Benjamin with this like relativization and delocalization somehow. Like you are trying to search for other other ways of dealing with things, with the past. How does this past can be seen differently from today, and how today can be lightened by the history in another way. So these are different ways. But normally, like when we turn to the international art, it's always like trying to see this experience of transformation and experience of regaining the identity, like trying to establish a new way of dealing with the past as well. So this is like a historical exercise, but also as this is the museum somehow of the contemporary art. So we want to not only to get back to like watch the past, because somehow this historiographic turn in Eastern Europe can be seen as melancholic. So somehow working with contemporary artists and with contemporary situations that can be related to this transformative experience can refresh this attitude. So this is the way how we try to deal.
Yeah.
I hope it's
No, that's a good answer. And so go rapidly moving on. Jesús, you know, it's so rigorous and well thought out. I think what the Reina Sofia is doing with the collection in terms of how it is rethinking what is a collection, what is an audience member, what kind of histories are we telling. Something that always strikes me when I walk around the Reina Sofia on the limited times I've been there, and also in your presentation, but also when I hear Manolo do presentations, is that it's always dealing with history, because this is a historical institution. So I wondered how this plays out in dealing with contemporary art, say of the last 10 years, and what kind of decisions you make about exhibiting and collecting very recent art, or is that a sort of a policy? Do you have a policy of not engaging with the very latest production?
I don't think there's such a policy. Probably I'm not the right person to give an answer, because I'm involved in the historical side. I'm the art historian of the house. But it's true that the Reina Sofia is an issue. I mean, we have a problem there. I mean, I don't think it's good that we have that problem. I mean, because other institutions do not have any problem, and just probably try to pick up what is more visible, or trying to hound the future, whatever. But I think that.
Why is it a problem?
It's a problem because as we have this very intense consciousness of history.
Yes, which incapacitates you in a certain respect for being able to decide what today is going to be important.
Especially because we also feel this second interpretation of what is contemporary. Contemporary is what is somehow it's strange. It's something that cannot be that is always in a dialectical relationship to the past. It's very hard to identify what the contemporary is, because by principle is unidentifiable. I mean, you cannot decide and design you are the contemporary. And I think that's a structural problem we have. And at the same time, this is a structural problem that also historically and contextually could be also exemplified with the fact that Reina Sofia, before us, was actually part of the market in Spain. So was actually collecting the contemporary related to the gallery's policies. That was what Reina Sofia was doing, breaking that inertia is being always part of our policies. So it's a really complex issue, but I think it's problematic, and we don't know how. Well, in this sense, it's not me because I'm not part of the collections, but I can think that it's a bit of a problem. It's an impossibility that we have, and if you think of it, why are we so obsessed with bizarre artists, bizarre mad people? I mean, people who are sort of completely on the periphery. Somehow, because I don't know whether it's a question of, I don't think it's a question of exoticism, that we like the bizarre. It's probably a symptom that we have a difficulty to deal with artists that represent the contemporary. Yeah. And that's, I don't know what is too complicated.
Okay, the public, you. Please ask some questions, although it's now 8:30.
I've got a question.
Good.
I was really interested, Jesús, in what you were saying about claiming legacy of lovers and bastards, and that it particularly struck me kind of when thinking about Tate Liverpool, actually, because I lived in Liverpool in the late 90s and early 2000s, and was very much kind of a witness to those early thematic hangs that Tate were experimenting with curators like Simon Groom. And I was just interested in all of the panels, perhaps answering who they perceive their lovers and bastards to be, and do you include the public in your analysis of that?
We all would like to have lovers, actually.
Without the bastards.
Yeah, well, I mean, the bastards are probably, we are all bastards in many respects. So I have the impression that that's one of the main problems. I think it was also Francesco's idea that that's the kind of tension that we want to. But I don't think that my problem is I'm not so convinced as you are that we can promote that. I mean, it has to the urgency to love or to have a relationship with specific artwork or specific cultural artifact has to come from the lover. I don't think. I mean, the more we try to be loved.
No, you can create situations where love can be met.
A romantic situation.
Probably this is going to be like a comedy of the 18th century. We are sort of performing these wonderful situations in which you sort of. Galleries. No, but it's a question. It's a bigger problem because I mean you also use the word users. Users are not lovers. So it's a question of how create these affections. Affection is a word that we are using a lot lately.
Yeah, and excuse me of returning to the example of Tate Liverpool because it's the one I'm most familiar with, being a British person and being someone that kind of. Exposed a lot to Tate thematic hangs, I suppose, as well. I was really interested, Francesco, in you talking a lot about involving the public, particularly in terms of feedback with this idea of clouds. How much do the public have involvement in the curation of the work beforehand, or does it only come after the exhibition is kind of manifest?
At the moment, it's more the second. I think that the interpretation is where to start because I think that we have experimented with Tate Collective, which is a group of young people who work around different kind of programming in Tate Liverpool, but also in the other Tates. I've curated a display. The difficulty of doing that is the amount of just knowledge of the collection that you need to acquire, and that requires a lot of time. So I find much more interesting at the moment to experiment with the idea of like knowledge generation that being in a room with certain works can make happen. So the making love with work in some way.
If I can just, I don't know if I was very long, but I don't know if I said enough about the public at the museum, for example. In Warsaw. And in Poland, the situation of the institutions is quite difficult because up to '89, the institutions were the places of oppression. So right now, what we are doing is to really make an institution to be a place of discussion. So learning how to discuss publicly was our main subject in the first 3 years. And as you could see in this furniture shop we are operating right now, this auditorium is the very, very central place. Yeah, we did it really in the very, very center. And right now we are working with the architect of the future museum, and the idea is that the auditorium is the very main place in the whole museum. So the collection spaces, the exhibition spaces will turn around, but the discussion will be the very, very center. This is also how we try to relate to the past. And of course, this language that we are, all these public programs, very rich public programs that we are running at the museum, this is also a way to bring the language into to our publics. But on the other side, right now, we are struggling with this language because we are extremely criticized. But this is also a place of this discussion and trying to see what this museum could be in the future. So that's why, the question that Claire raised before about how do we try to relate to this international art scene is really trying to negotiate the new place. How do you deal with your past and how do you see it in a new way? So this is, but this relation between love and hate, this is something that we are really struggling with every single day. When you learn somebody to speak and then he screams at you, you have to deal with that.
Yeah, I think that's important. You have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah. Give it up.
When you give the voice to somebody, they will click the screen.
Yeah. This is great also, like as a child.
I was thinking about the question of collections from the perspective of an institution such as this that doesn't collect, and that in this country and elsewhere is for that reason quite vulnerable, and that would it not be necessary for, as well as for collection to function critically and function critically in relationship to history or their audiences, but they also serve the function of being, if you like, gold bullion in the basement, and that they preserve, they prevent the museum from being able to be removed. If funding is removed, then the museum can't be closed down because it has valuable works in its bunkers, and that kind of role of the collection will always be kind of structurally necessary. So you couldn't get to the point where you handed over who chose which works were bought, you handed that over to the public, because you need someone who's going to tell you that work is going to be worth a significant amount of money in the future, just so that the museum isn't made precarious.
Is that a question for anyone in particular?
No,
It's a comment.
Yeah, it's a comment.
It's across the board.
Well, that's an issue, but I think the wealth of the collection was something that was very important, as owned by the museum. It was very important for the whole art world, because they were the central banks that gave value to the market somehow. But in the contemporary sort of financial economy, I think that role is gone. And I think that the whole idea of value is moving, and so I don't think any institution with or without a collection is safe. I think that this idea of that you are sitting on a treasure is not as it used to be, because the art world doesn't work like that anymore.
For the museum in Warsaw, for example, the collection is like the only stable thing that we have, for example, because like without any spaces, with this provisional state of like hoping for a building, like this collection somehow is something really that shows us where we are. Of course, this is a moving sand as well, but somehow one of these amazing and moments that we like in the beginning, when we didn't have any collection, any spaces, we had to discuss and rediscuss and again and again, and then the collection appeared, and it was an amazing moment. And but as I said, this collection also like knows that this is like our idea, and somehow we are negotiating with others, but we are trying to be unafraid to try out multiple stories, and often many at a time. We are trying to treat ourselves provisionally and in constant transition, incessant and negotiation, I don't know, and redefinition. So, but somehow the collection in our in the Warsaw situation is really something that promises that this museum will happen one day.
Jesús, maybe could you say something about the International and the idea of sharing collections, which is being developed at the moment between 7 institutions in Europe?
Yep. Well, it's again an experiment, and we don't know how much are we going to make of it, because as most of our institutions are based on, I mean, these collections display are based on narratives. First, we should share and interact our narratives in order to move our collections around. I think this is happening very slowly, but if you go to the new display in Ljubljana, you'll see a few works from Muka and Eindhoven, not yet from Reina Sofia. For instance, in Reina Sofia, we haven't developed a knowledge about the history of Eastern Europe, so it doesn't fit within our narratives yet. But it will be a good opportunity that this happens.
But do you think the International also provides some some sense of stability for these institutions in light of what Isabel's asking about the collection in the past has been the gold bullion in the basement, and now with funding being stripped from museums, that this provides a different form of stability?
It could be. I mean, obviously, institutions are in risk at this point, and they could see it as part of a new stability, or a new way of creating a stability that doesn't depend on national funds, for instance. But I don't think it's only that. I wish I hope that it's not just a structure that is trying to provide stability to institutions. If you think of it, none of our institutions are in danger because we've somehow created our own governance. I think MUCA is not in danger. They are wealthy. And Van Ave is not in danger. It's just, at this moment, it's in a sort of crossroad, and the others are not. But
maybe also stability in terms of, and obviously each national museum has a different relationship with the government in charge, and I know that, for example, the Reina Sofia's directorship is a government appointment.
Yes.
So with a change of government, a change of director can come in, and all the work that you've been doing can get reversed.
Well, it's not exactly like that, because for the first time, our team hasn't been appointed by the government.
Right.
It's the first time that, that Manolo has been the first director that was appointed by through an international context. So that's why we were with the left, and now we are with the right.
Right. And we should bring this to a close, probably. But we will be in the bar, so just come and ask questions.
Yeah.
As we drink. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And for the speakers.
We never leave space for people to speak, but people are used to that, I guess.
I wonder.
Every patient.
Sorry to be so long.
Oh, no.